Hello and welcome to episode 21 of the ThinkPad Museum podcast, recorded on the 10th of January 2026, the very first episode in the new year. And no, your podcatcher isn't broken. This is a very special episode, so we are kicking the year off with a special. This is why this episode is recorded in English. As you might have already seen, we are going to talk about the ThinkPad X300, a very special machine. And of course, I'm not going to do this all by myself. Our special guest today is Thomas, also known from Laptop Retrospective. Hi, Thomas.
Hello, Christian. Thank you so much for having me. This is going to be awesome.
Definitely. I'm so glad that we finally managed to find a date where we both can participate in an interesting conversation, because it's not that easy to find time slots between our countries.
It is a bit of a jump, yep.
Definitely. So we're going to talk about this later. Maybe we start with some feedback and announcements. So, like in every other episode, we're going to talk about some news from the museum, because I managed to get two very rare machines that have just been added to the collection, and I'm very proud about this. So this is why I'm bringing this up here. One of those machines is a ThinkPad 360 PE. That's a very, very special machine that's incredibly hard to get these days. For those who don't know, that's a machine manufactured between 1994 and 96. And it's a 9.5-inch convertible tablet. And that's pretty crazy for the early 90s, I would say. I think it's going to be one of the very first tablets at all, I think. So the screen can be rotated in the display frame. It has an VGA resolution and 256 colors. And it also offers a digitizer pen that's very much like the later X tablet model. So you can use that old digitizer pen on the new X tablet and vice versa. That's kind of interesting. Did you manage to ever saw one of those rare machines from that day?
I've never seen one in person, and you're absolutely right. They are rare and very difficult to get. You are the third person that I know that has one. You don't see them come up for sale, and when they do, and I don't know if you also saw it on eBay for years, there was one for like six figures that somebody was trying to sell, and it's like, So I hope that you didn't pay anywhere near that, because they are very cool, but yeah, they fetch some very high prices if people know what they are.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's hard to guess what the price would be these days. We know what the former price was, and if we calculate in inflation, this is going to be ridiculous. And I think the value of it is hard to put in numbers, because it's a rare machine. It's a very special machine that's hard to get, and it's a very historic machine. This is why I plan to, after I tried all the things that I want to try on that machine, to give it to a real museum where people can go in and have a look at it. That's way too special to just have it sitting in my working room. So this is what's going to happen maybe later or maybe next year with that machine. But speaking of the hardware details, it is equipped with an Intel 486 CPU. It has 20 megabytes of memory, a whopping 340 megabytes hard drive, and it comes with Windows 3.1 with the Windows for Pen Computer 1.0 extension. Did you ever see that one?
Not running. I've seen some old VHS video of that operating system in action that was digitized. But no, I've never seen it run in person. I acquired a ThinkPad T7 or 710 and 730T that were pretty much scrap, and you could tell just based on the old style of display that it wouldn't have looked like anything that we would consider a tablet computer today. It's almost like the dinosaur version.
Yeah, definitely. So I had some fun. I put one of my X tablets beside that one. I think it was an X200T tablet. And yeah, it's very much like that "don't talk to me and my son again" memes, because the 360 PE is very bulky, but a lot of things those machines have in common. And speaking of Windows for Pen Computer 1.0, there are also some things that this very early operating system has in common with things like the Windows XP Tablet PC edition that came out, I think, 2005 or something like that. So the input dialogues where you can write letters and then it will be converted into normal text, that already existed that back then in the early 90s, and that's kind of mind-blowing, I think. So very interesting. I think we will need to cover this on a dedicated episode in more details. And speaking of bulky, this machine weighs 3.1 kilograms. So that's not a light catch for your backpack.
No.
Definitely not. So the next machine, also very rare one, is a 755 CDV that also was built between May 1995 and October 96, so also mid-90s machine. It has a 10.4-inch display with 64K colors, and that's a real interesting detail. It has a removable cover so that the screen can be mounted on an overhead projector. And I think nothing says more, hey, I'm from the 90s, like, hey, I'm using an overhead projector, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I never saw a machine like that in person by now. I know that some other vendors like Siemens also produced machines that are overhead projector focused in the 90s. And I was extremely lucky to get also that one. That's a very niche device, I would say, also quite hard to get. The most hardware details are unknown to me by this point because I did manage to get mine running though. I think it could be an Pentium 1 or an 486 machine. I also have the power supply for that machine, but I can also turn it on, but I hear fans spinning and the hard drive spinning up, but nothing that's shown on the screen. So maybe I need to have a look at it. Maybe some battery is just broken or something like that.
Yeah, the 755 era is very persnickety. I bought two.
Oh, really?
Yes, of 755s. One was just a regular one, and one I actually thought was a CDV. And I was heartbroken to get it. And the badge was correct, but somebody at some point had swapped out the whole top case. So the top case was from a regular 755 and not, in fact, the one where the panel comes off the back and you can lay it down. And I was very bummed out that it was not that one, because I was like, wow, this is a rare model. I have an overhead projector that I could demo this with. Like, I could I was ready. But yeah, it turned out that at some point it was delivered to an IBM repair center and they didn't replace the top case with a CDV case. It was just a regular case.
What a bummer.
Yeah.
So really hope that you find one of those machines at some time.
Yeah, I'm not holding my breath. That's going to be a hard one.
Definitely, and I'm really, really lucky because I know somebody who also collects retro hardware, so greetings to Jan Lukas at that point. And he meets a lot of people that also collect hardware, or he finds hardware at some very strange places. I don't know exactly how he managed to do so. And because he's not collecting IBM stuff, whenever he sees one of those fancy machines, he gives me a call. Hey, Christian, I have a 701C right here. Do you want me to pick it up for you? And the answer always is yes, please go ahead. Tell me your price. Yeah, so thanks a lot for that, because otherwise I think I wouldn't have the chance to get one of those machines, to be honest. Yeah, and I think you also had a conversation with Dr. Ted Sulker because one of those CDV machines, right?
Yes, so when I spoke to him a while ago now, he talked to me about how he was one of the people that helped build that thing. And he understood the technology on how the screen was actually built and how IBM was manufacturing these machines. And he was like, all I have to do is just like take these back pieces off. And he's such a tinkerer, even to this day, that like he bought these 755s and he pulled them apart and he was able to find that transparent piece that he was able to put on an overhead projector. And IBM obviously saw that, loved it, and then produced it for a couple of years. And it was probably meeting a need that wasn't quite there, but it was still really, really cool. And that was a time, I think, in IBM's history where they were still experimenting with weird.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
that went away in the later years, but that's a weird time at IBM.
Definitely, yeah. I also think about the Transnote, which was also one of those weirdo experiments. Very, very unique. And I mean, they even made a left-handed version of for an even more unique audience. So tinkering was quite important to IBM back then.
Yeah, the Transnote has a whole history, but we'll save that for another day.
Yeah, definitely. Let's jump to some of the news. So, while we are recording this, CES in Las Vegas just took place. Have you ever been there?
Not in person. I have media credentials to go every year, but getting down to the United States sometimes is a bit tricky, and it's also something that I'd have to take off time from work to do, which isn't impossible, but I would need to go down there for a real good reason. So one day I hope to make it, but I haven't made it in person yet.
Same for me. So I just follow the news, and there were two ThinkPad related news. Also, Intel announced their new processors, but I think I will keep that for a future episode because not all the details are available in that level that I would like to discuss it. But Lenovo announced that they are going to release a ThinkPad X9 15P Aura edition. So it's a new member of the X9 family that was discussed very emotionally last year, I would say, to put it in that way. And the new model is going to aim at MacBook Pro users. So this is going to be a performance machine, as we can guess from the P in 15P, like for previous performance machines. So it's an X9 machine for power users, I would say. While the normal X9 variants are aiming at MacBook Air users, this is going to be for the professionals. Maybe some hardware details. We're going to see a 15.3-inch 2.8K OLED display with whopping 1000 nits HDR peak brightness. That's like a lot, I would say.
Yeah, that's high.
That's really, really high. I think that's maybe one of the brightest displays we ever see in a ThinkPad. I think there was some T15G model with 1200 nits or so, but it's rather the exception than the rule, I would say, to have that much brightness. Of course, we're going to have a 10 megapixel webcam and up to the Intel Core Ultra X9 Series 3 CPU, the new ones that have just been released. We have solid memory up to 64 gigabytes DDR5 and a whopping 88 watt hours battery. Also, we have Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.4, Thunderbolt, USB-A, HDMI, a card reader, and audio in and out. So I would say normal specs these days, but what really caught my attention is that this model is going to have 6 speakers and 2 microphones, and that's very unusual for a ThinkPad, I would say.
Yeah. ThinkPads are not held up in high regard for their audio capability. Like, they've gotten a lot better when they started making upward firing speakers and thin chassis, but that's like the one thing that most enthusiasts will kind of agree on is you don't really buy a ThinkPad for its audio system. So
yeah,
we'll see.
Definitely. I think that's also quite hard to compete up against Apple devices at that point because they really have very good speakers and good microphones. And I have a very old MacBook Pro from 10 years ago that still has better sound than my current daily driver. So I think it's a different focus on your audience. So it's hard to compare those two devices. So any other details? We have a fingerprint on the power button. We have a webcam shutter for privacy, and the weight is just 1.5 kilograms. That sounds interesting. Maybe we can talk a little bit about what's your point on the X9 series. That's the latest member of the ThinkPad family.
Well, I think I won't try to remember the person's name, but it came out last year that the reason that they called it the X9 is because it is the furthest away from the X1. And it's like, you know what? I think that is an okay approach to take because you're not trying to say that this is like every other ThinkPad, because it isn't. There's some huge departures from design language that I think scared a lot of traditional fans, because the track point is missing, the colors it was offered in. It didn't look necessarily like a traditional ThinkPad would that, Richard Sapper helped design. It didn't have that sleek, black, mysterious box look. I still wonder a bit why it was called a ThinkPad. Like, to me, it's a very nice think book. But I also understand that the think book kind of fits in a certain price bracket that a premium ThinkPad may not. So we will see how long they produce the X9 for and how well it does, because they've produced the Z13 and Z15. I can't remember, but when they revitalized the Z series, that kind of came and went. I'm curious to see if the X9 will stay for the long haul in the lineup. But I didn't panic as much as some people did at CES last year when that thing came out. And even when they made the white version and people were talking about, ThinkPads are now white, and it's like, well, actually, ThinkPads have been. Yeah, they were at the beginning, and that was a whole problem. And like, I remember, talking to Tom Hardy about that very issue with the DIN standards over in Germany and how that was, controlling the industry of what colors PCs could be. But yeah, experiment, go play. It wouldn't be what I would have called it, but I don't make those decisions. If it gets more people looking at the ThinkPad line, I guess that's not a bad thing.
I think so as well. So of course I would rather choose to have a ThinkPad with a track point, but from a business perspective, I mean, have a look at how IT departments work these days, or big companies work these days. You have normal corporate workers with their business machines, let it be HP, Dell, Lenovo, whatever, and you have a lot of people that are using MacBooks these days for developing purposes, for creative stuff. And of course, this is an opportunity to make another device that would fit in their needs, and have a ThinkPad that's more looks like a MacBook and is more stylish, has better sound. Why not? So I can see why they decided to play with that kind of devices. And I also like to hear that they still keep up the track point. So they said it very loud and very, very clearly that the track point is going to stay. And this is just for the people that maybe just started working after their university, and they never saw old ThinkPad because they are 20 years old. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And when they were born, they weren't able to use old ThinkPads. So they do not know these kind of devices, and you can approach these customers easily if you have a device that looks like a MacBook. So yeah, why not? Let's see. I'm also curious to see what will happen in the X9 series. So the second news is about the X1 Carbon Gen 14, so the very latest variant of that series, with better repairability. So maybe let's focus on what the X1 Carbon looked like the last couple of years. So ever since the X1 Carbon Gen 2, the mainboard was mounted directly against the keyboard frame. So a lot of dismantling was required in order if you wanted to replace the keyboard. It was possible, but it was really painful, I would say. Mm-hmm. And now they came up with a new design they named the Space Frame. And this means that the keyboard frame is now separated from the main structure frame. And this is going to assist you because it's easier and faster to replace. So this looks basically interesting, I would say. Do you have any opinions on that?
I do. It is, to me, a return to form a bit. If you think about when the magnesium roll cage was first added to ThinkPad design, that is very similar to what they're doing here. But what it really reminds me of, and I have it here for demonstration purposes, is a T430U. Mm-hmm. Because the T430U was a one-off model that had essentially a screwless entry on the bottom. And if you open that up and take a look at the inside of the device, you can see that there are components that are available on this side and if you take out the keyboard, there are components available on the other side. So the space frame, I think, is a bit of a return to form rather than a brand new idea. They might be doing it for brand new reasons, though.
Yeah.
I think that would probably be the key difference there.
That's interesting. We're going to put a link to the T430U in the show notes, and of course a picture of yours, because it looks really interesting. I never saw the T430U from the back because I do not have one in my collection, and it's considered one of the very first Ultrabooks of ThinkPad lineup before it was officially named Ultrabook, because this is an Intel trademark as far as I remember.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very much a one-off experimental machine that they didn't really keep any design cues of in later models. However, when we look at that space frame idea, I think that they might have gone back into their records as well as looked around at what other people were doing. A bit of column A, a bit of column B. I wouldn't call it a copy of, say, like a framework or anything. It's still very different, but you can definitely tell that there are a few design cues that they looked around and said, how can, because ultimately they need to make it profitable. And adding something that is repairable usually means you're adding components that drive up the cost of a machine. So how can you reduce cost or increase value in other areas? So when they're talking about how many watts they can get a CPU to push in that thin chassis, that's probably the bigger thing that helped them make that decision, not necessarily the repairability. Because they're like, well, if we can get the airflow in there, increase the performance, and say that we can push this chip harder and faster than the other guy, we actually have a product that we can claim has more value, because it does, and then help maybe hide some of that repairability cost, because screw posts and screws, they take up room, they add manufacturing time. Like, it all adds up, especially when you're producing, hundreds of thousands of machines.
Definitely. And thermals is a very good reason to do this kind of refresh, because this is also something that they mentioned specifically, that cooling is now able to cool up to 30 watts of thermal design power. Previously, it just has been 20 watts. And this is required because the G14 also now comes with Intel's latest Panther Lake CPU, so the Core Ultra 300H series, aka Core Ultra X7. They are really into finding new fancy names, aren't they? It's so hard to keep up with that.
Speaking of keeping up in fancy names, I do hope that they keep the naming nomenclature for the Gen 14 better than they did the Gen 13. Because the Gen 13 came with so many different CPU configurations. It was very, very frustrating. Notebook Check did a great article on it. And even when I was looking to be like, do I want to buy a Gen 13? It was a minefield of different CPU configurations, even though they were all called the same thing. Very frustrating. So hopefully they tidy that up.
It's really hard to get into the details, because sometimes you see G13s with very good pricing, and then you have a look at the hardware specs, and then you see, okay, I see. That's exactly the CPU generation I do not want to have. There are big differences between the two variants that Intel offered. Yeah. So the G14 also brings up to 64 gigabyte of soldered DDR5 memory. We have the keyboard that has been slightly updated. And speaking of repairability, I think this relates to the fact that the USB-C ports are now modular. So they have a small daughter board, and that daughter board can be replaced. I think they did that last year on one of the P models, and they said that they are going to do this for new models as well. And the G14 X1 Carbon is the very first one in this year that also gets that update. So this is quite good. The weight is still less than 1 kilogram, and that's not very much. That's very much like the X1 Nano, which was the slimmest and the lightest ThinkPad they made in the last couple of years. Very interesting. Last detail, we still have a 40-inch display. That could be the 2.8K OLED variant or the full HD display with a 10 megapixel web camera. So one of those machines appealing to you?
I will say it does. So I'm still using my X1 Nano Gen 1. to this very day. Although it is starting to slow down with 16 gigabytes of RAM, and of course it's soldered, and that was the max configuration I think you could get for it at the time. So the idea that I could get a X1 Carbon that is the same weight, because let me tell you, the weight on that machine is phenomenal in terms of its usability. There is no place that you couldn't take it, that you couldn't take a sheet of foolscap paper. And this is probably the first machine since then that has actually got my interest as a possible replacement.
Yeah, the X1 Nano is a lovely machine. I would love to get one of those as well. But it's not that easy to get. It's at fair prices in used conditions. And I mean, it's way too young to be put in a museum, right? So maybe.
Perhaps not, but they also don't make them anymore, which I can understand why, I suppose, because it's like, well, the X1 Carbon has kind of become the Nano. So unless you make a Nano, like, what are you going to do? So we'll see.
Yeah, right. And I mean, it's a 13-inch display, and the X1 Carbon has a 14-inch display, so it's not a huge difference that it would make sense to have two dedicated machines. If the XN1 Nano would have been a 10 or 12-inch display, okay, then it would have made sense, but nobody uses those tiny machines these days anymore, right? So 10 or 12-inch displays are kind of worn out, I would say.
No, I would agree with you on that. And the footprint of a old 14-inch machine can now fit into a old 13-inch machine. Like, the amount that they're able to shrink down a device over the decades is impressive. So it's no longer your display is this many inches, therefore your machine is going to be this big. Like, I had a Gen 12 X1 Carbon that I was quite surprised how close it was in size to my X1 Nano. I was like, oh, it's going to be like a whole inch bigger, and it's like, it actually wasn't.
Yeah, it's not a big difference. So Thomas, let's talk a bit about yourself. So I'm very, very happy that we managed to do this conversation today, but let's assume some of our listeners never heard about you and Laptop Retrospective. Mm-hmm. Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself? What are you known for? What's your connection with ThinkPads?
Okay. So in 2017, I had some free time. And like a person with free time, you usually find ways to keep yourself busy. And I wanted to do a couple of things. The first thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to start messing around with Linux. So I read online, and this is in 2017, and everybody was saying you need to get an old ThinkPad and to start with Linux. Like, you know, spend a modest amount of money, go get a ThinkPad, and use that as your experimentation machine. So that's what I did. I went to a used computer shop that refurbished stuff, and they had this ThinkPad X220. And I was
Lovely
like, this
machine.
thing is, like, it's so cool, it's so small, it's sleek, it's black, it's got all the ports. And full disclosure, for work, I was using a MacBook Retina. And that continued until that machine was no longer of any value to me, and then I switched back to Windows. But that was my first introduction to both ThinkPads and Linux, was that X220. And at that time, at least where I am, like, people didn't know about Linux locally. Like, the people I talked to don't know about it. The circles that I ran in weren't really talking about it. And I would show them this machine, and it would be faster than their Windows laptop that they had spent like 90% more money than I did. I think I bought that X220 for like 200 Canadian dollars in 2017. And that did a couple things. It either frustrated them, confused them, or had them asking me, where do I get one? So that started a bit of a route of documentation, because I realized that there wasn't a lot of content out there that was accessible to the the casual individual. The content that was being produced at the time I felt was either like really, really specialized and didn't have a low bar of entry, or was, I'm gonna use the word overproduced. It was very much a show, and it was very commercialized. There was like product placements. There was a lot of stuff, and I'm like, well, what if somebody just talked about the machine and that was it? Like, it would not be super entertaining necessarily, but it would be very informative. People would get what they need and they could go about their business. And that's kind of where things would start for the channel and both my journey with ThinkPad. And I would help people that I know acquire these machines. I'd set them up on Linux and they would be very happy with it. And I would produce videos on the machines that I would purchase for people before I gave them to them, just to document what I was doing. I'd put it out there. And anytime that I took apart a laptop, now I was putting it underneath a camera and filming it and just putting it online for people to watch. And that seems to have been, I'll say, modestly successful for a person that's not looking to make a career out of this or do it full time or rely on YouTube ad revenue. And to answer your second question, kind of how things really got started with ThinkPad beyond the X220, is it was very clear that people loved ThinkPads on the internet. I know that's a huge shock for your listeners, that people like ThinkPads on the internet. So I started to seek out, well, what are the cool ThinkPads? Because I am coming to the game late, ladies and gentlemen, so late in terms of like the history and all of the things that I missed in 2017. Like, that's only that's not even 10 years yet of coverage, and I was just consuming huge amounts of information about ThinkPad, because like, here is a brand that has lasted longer than any other portable computer brand to date. Like, no one has lasted longer. And that not only did the machines fascinate me, but the stories behind the people that came up with this idea, the fact that this idea was able to persist and go through all of these changes and still look the same and give the same nostalgic experience. So I was filming for a while, maybe about a year and a bit, all these different machines. And I got in touch, well, I saw this article that was like the top 10 ThinkPads, and there's loads of articles out there like this. And I went through the list, and I'm like looking for things that I might be able to acquire that were not super expensive that I could film. And I'd be like, oh, this would be probably really interesting. Like, I didn't know enough at the time to determine for myself what was interesting. I was kind of relying on all of that community history that came before. And I found out about this X300 machine. And then I found out that there was a book that has essentially been written on its entire development. And I was like, well, this is obviously something I have to talk about. And I posted on Twitter about the book and the work that I was looking into. And by chance, that is where David Hill reached out and said, hey, that's a ThinkPad book, but have you seen these ThinkPad books? And they were his Design, Spirit, and Essence books. And I'm like, no, where do I get them? And he's like, well, you don't, because they're not like commercially available. And then in a private message, like, would you like me to send you some?
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, yes. Yes, I would very much like you to send me them. Yeah, it's these two here. So the large one was produced for the 20th anniversary when they had the exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art. So that's it's very, very similar to the book that you would see, that you can find online very easily, which is the 25th anniversary edition. and I can
Wow.
leave a link for where your viewers can see it. But this one was only included in the ThinkPad 25th anniversary edition, so the T25.
Mm-hmm.
And he sent me both of these books, which was exceptionally kind of him. And we were still talking afterward. And I said, and this is just where you ask the question. Like, you have, like, I know who I'm talking to. I know how important they are to ThinkPad history. But it's the question you don't ask is the one that's never answered. And I said, hey, would you be willing to talk about the X300 and maybe we could, like, record something? And he was like, yeah, I'd love to. And the rest is history.
Wow. That's just awesome. And I mean, it really speaks for itself that they are so interested in sharing their thoughts. So they're interested in the topic, and they really like to talk about the topic that drives them. And I think people always think, I do not need to try to get in contact with that person and try to arrange an interview because I will be ghosted. Quite often people really love talking about those topics and are up to that kind of conversation. So, but I didn't know that he reached out to you on Twitter. That's a fascinating story.
Yeah, he saw the Steve Ham book, this one right here, and as you can see,
Yeah.
it's very well read. And we'll probably mention this a little later, but if you are a person that either loves ThinkPads or loves computers and you don't have this book, then your collection is incomplete.
Yeah, definitely. And I try to get this one for my collection as well. I think that's the way how we got more in touch with each other, because I commented some of your Mastodon posts and I was looking for some books, and I posted one of the ThinkPad books that I was able to get, and then you commented on it, hey, you need to get these and that ones as well. So that one is still missing in my collection.
It's a must-have. Like,
Yeah.
Steve Ham interviewed so many people that are no longer with us, and it's a probably one of the better comprehensive pieces of just notebook and laptop history. Not only, IBM and Lenovo history and ThinkPad history. It covers all of those beautifully. But we'll get to that topic later.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. So this also answers my next question, how you managed to interview all those important people, because you spoke to David Hill and to other persons as well. So I assume you just wrote them a mail and said, hey, I did an interview with David Hill. Why don't we go ahead and also do a recording?
David has also been very gracious with his connections to arrange some of those interviews. I really do need to give credit where credit is due. He's been exceptionally kind and generous with sharing his connections as well. So I was able to connect with Tom Hardy, who was like one of the first industrial designers working on ThinkPad with Richard Sapper, Tom and like Tom Takahashi, like the people that were there at the very, very, very beginning. That was a phenomenal conversation. He helped me connect with George Caritas, Dr. John Caritas' brother, and we talked about John's journey, which is still one of my favorite interviews. It was just beautiful is the only word I can use for it. Anything else undersells it. And the recent interview that we just did with David Sherbuck is another example of David graciously using his connections to kind of help tell all of these stories that might otherwise be lost. And I think they help inform a much more comprehensive and well-rounded and informed history around a topic that a lot of people love.
Definitely. And I think also your listeners, I would say, or the people that subscribe to your YouTube channel are of the same opinion, because 30K people watch your content. And I also had a look at some of your videos, because they are just an awesome source for researchers. So thanks a lot for all the work that you did and all the interviews. They are so valuable.
Well,
Totally makes sense to have them online. So maybe speaking of your collection, I tried to find out on your website how many machines you have in your collection and whether you have any favorites, but I couldn't get an answer.
So The number in the collection, I have not counted. Not that I'm afraid to. It's not like it's not an obsessive collection, because there are some machines that are, I'll refer to them as iterative. They're not like tent poles of ThinkPad history. So I would say that it's a modest collection of probably maybe 25 machines. And yeah, I try to go after the ones that are significant historically, or I find them personally interesting. And of course, the ones that I can literally just afford to acquire and showcase to the world. There are some machines I know I will never get in my collection because the cost is a barrier. I get a small amount of ad revenue from YouTube, and then that goes right back into the acquisition of machines and filming equipment. So it's its own self-contained budget. In terms of favorites, like the ones that I like go down into the kind of my little museum, as it were, and mess around with, let's see if I can narrow it down for you. I mean, one of the obvious answers we'll talk about later is the X300. That is probably one of the most, if not the most important ThinkPad that was ever built. And that's a very controversial thing to say, I know. But if you look at everything that came after, it's quite clear that that was a very key moment. So the X300 is important. I do have a 701C, and that machine obviously captures the imagination of everybody. When people have a list of really cool ThinkPads, that one is always on there. They made the model kit for it on the 10th anniversary. It has that mystique and wonder about it. Practicality is an entirely other matter, because it is not very practical, and there's a bit of tragedy there. But it captures the imagination, and it's a lot of fun to mess about with. And obviously, there's kind of a personal connection, being able to talk to George about his brother and get a better understanding of who John was as a person. Adds a lot to that machine that other people have not had the opportunity to add, and that makes it special to me. There is a machine that I got recently that it's just the pinnacle of weird, and it's that ThinkPad with the bubble jet printer built into it. That was
awesome.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Like, why would you do that? And of course, it's not in operational condition, and it needs so much work that it's probably beyond my skill set to do. But it really highlights to me just how far in those early days, in the mid to early 90s, where anything went in like the notebook industry. Like, we just hadn't figured it out that no, the notebook needs to be this, and for people to actually want to use it. Like, no, we're going to make projector screens, we're going to make printers go inside of it, we're going to make the keyboard expand, we're going to have straps so you can carry it around on your chest. Like, it just represents to me that, that top of the mountain, let's just do it. So that to me is pretty fun.
Lovely. It's the 550BJ, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So the first one. That's ridiculously hard to get, and that's a very interesting machine. So congratulations, you managed to get one. Really looking forward to your video on that one.
Yeah, I did a top 5 video on ThinkPads I haven't properly filmed yet, and I did feature it in that one because it's I don't know if I'm ever going to get the chance to feature this. I could keep going, but there's one more, just for the sake of time, that I'll pull out, and it's not a ThinkPad. It's the Lenovo Skylight.
Oh yeah.
The story behind the Lenovo Skylight is one of brilliance, fun, a little bit of tragedy because it never got built, and that thing is just gorgeous. It's just sleek and red, and it's where we saw what would eventually become the new ThinkPad keyboard. Like, that's where that whole design of the scooped chiclet style keys started with, and that was that collaborative effort between Richard Sapper and David Hill and his team. And the reason that I hold it out, not only because of that, but because of the provenance of the machine. Like, it's the only machine that I own that was never released. Like, it's got that mystique around it. I've got a really good idea where it came from as well, and I know that there's a pretty direct connection between where it came from and the development team that worked on it. So that's really cool. And yeah, it's a look into what if, or what could have been that wasn't. And for me, that kind of makes it stand out as a very special machine.
It is, definitely. I never heard about that one before I saw your video on that. So we're going to link that. You did a very interesting video about that machine. And it's a real time capsule, yeah? What could have been that wasn't? Mm-hmm. That's a nice way to phrase that machine. So, speaking of all those fancy machines in your collection, what's your daily driver? Do you have any machine that you use on a daily basis?
So, the daily driver is the Lenovo ThinkPad X1 Nano, Gen 1. And I went through so much deliberation. So, to give you a very quick, speedy overview of the laptops that I have owned, because I couldn't afford a laptop before I went to university. So it's actually a very short list of laptops that I have used for work and that sort of thing. So I started with a Toshiba 810 satellite Pentium 4 laptop that was open box. Everything about that thing was mediocre. And the battery life was atrocious. And then the netbook came on the scene. And then I bought an Acer Aspire 1 A101 or something netbook. And I was just fascinated that, one, this is a real laptop that's running a real version of Windows. And two, this 10-inch machine fits on the lecture desk at my university. And I have this big honking battery that it lasts all day. I'm like, this is the future. So, like, when people, dump on the netbook, like, these things were garbage, why did we build them? And it's like, it's okay, it wasn't for you, but I love that thing to death.
Yeah, definitely.
And it sold me on small machines. And then after that, it was a HP Touch Smart TM2, which didn't stick around for very long because I did buy it new and it had an anemic i3 processor. And then I went to a MacBook Pro Retina because they had time capsule technology, and I had my cat walked across my keyboard one day and I lost a week's worth of work. And Mac at the time, to my knowledge, had the best backup support system that was built into the OS. And then after that, I went back to Windows with the Surface Book 2, which I still use on the desk. I'm actually on it right now. And that's because it is the best laptop that I have in terms of web camera. It has a very, very good web camera. Certainly better than the 720p one that's in the X1 Nano, because webcams weren't important to most people before COVID. Definitely. And then COVID changed that. So, yeah, and then the X1 Nano came out at a time where I was looking to change to a ThinkPad, because the purchase of the Surface Book 2 and the beginning of my journey researching and documenting ThinkPad were kind of happening at the same time. And it's like, well, my next computer is going to be a ThinkPad, but which one? So I went through looking at like the T14 at the time, or the X13 at the time, or the T14S, and I researched those into the ground because the differences were, very nuanced. And then they released the X1 Nano Gen 1, and it's like, here's a laptop that has a, 2.8K color, 100% color accurate screen, which I wanted. It was small, and the thing was less than a kilogram. And the only detractor that I had at the time was like, oh, it's only got 2 USB C ports and a headphone jack. Golly, that's going to be hard. And then it wasn't. It just wasn't. The whole issue of dongle life has never been a barrier. And we've gotten better at building dongles, so that issue just went away entirely. And it wasn't until last year that I've even started looking at a replacement for it.
Very good, very good. I can see myself in some of the things that you just said, because I was also a big fan of the netbook devices that were out there. I bought one of the very first ones, the Asus EPC 701G. That's just a 7-inch display machine, and I also, because of this machine, I also fell in love with small machines. I bought myself a Toshiba Libretto 100 CT that I still have in my collection, and yeah, those tiny machines have a very special place in my heart, so I can relate to that one. So maybe just 5 short questions to get to know you even better. So for our listeners, they are not part of the shared document that Thomas and I are having a look at it. So he's not prepared about the things that I'm going to ask right now.
Yep, I have not seen these questions. Let's go.
Start with the easy one. Would you prefer IBM or Lenovo ThinkPads? What's your cup of tea?
Oh, you said you're starting with the easy one. Okay, I have an answer for this, and it might shock a couple people. I do prefer Lenovo, and the reason I say that is a simple one. IBM built that brand. There is no denying that IBM built that brand. They were not the best stewards of that brand. And this is just what I have gathered from talking to people and looking at probably over 100 ThinkPads. And it is toward the end, like I would say after the year 2000, when they're starting to murmur internally about selling the PC business, innovation died. The quality started to drop. There were heavy cost-cutting restrictions. And many people that I've talked to simply were talking about IBM turning off the hot water in the shower. And I know that that's a very unpopular thing to say for a lot of diehard IBM enthusiasts, but if you look at some of the machines that were being built, especially toward the end of IBM's tenure with the brand, they had a lot of quality control issues. They weren't even building their own machines at that point. They were outsourcing to different companies like Acer. Lenovo was already a manufacturer. LG was building machines. The brand was there, but I think the quality that a lot of people associate with some of the original machines was starting to go away. So if you were to say to me I could have a modern IBM ThinkPad and a Lenovo ThinkPad, again, even though Lenovo has done a lot of things that the enthusiast community has struggled with, I think overall that they were the better stewards of the brand.
That's a good answer.
Yeah, and it's one that I have to usually explain to people because they have in their mind the nostalgia of IBM being the original company that built that brand, and that is absolutely true. They did so much cool stuff. They laid the groundwork. They made the design. But all of those people, like the majority of them, were still there when Lenovo picked it up, and they gave them a budget. They gave them the opportunity to continue to innovate rather than be like, oh, this is just good enough. Oh, we can save some money cutting the costs here. We can make these plastics cheaper. We can make the ThinkLight amber because it's cheaper.
Yeah.
Like the fact that those conversations are happening is not healthy. And the fact that they were about to give it, like, it was a toss-up, a two-way toss-up between Lenovo buying it and this finance group in the United States buying the brand. Like, that's how close we were to probably losing ThinkPad. And it's all in Steve Ham's book. It's a must-read. If my answer to if that question makes you upset, you need to go read Steve Ham's book.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I also have this kind of conversation with other people, and some people also say IBM has been the better vendor. And then when you go into the details, then it quickly comes out that those people that say these things mostly relates to IBM in terms of ThinkPads because of machines like the 760 series, about the 701 series, but they do not think about that. For example, we had the X20 series that had serious problems with mainboards just dying, or maybe the T20 that had a lot of internal problems in the beginning and later revisions fixed that. That's something that not everybody is talking about, or maybe just forgot about in all those years. So I think, yeah, your answer totally makes sense. So maybe now an easier one. What's your pick for the operating system on your ThinkPads, Windows or Linux? Because you mentioned you are also trying to start using Linux in 2017.
Mm-hmm. So because of and I don't know if this is true for everybody else. So if you're listening to this podcast or you're watching this on YouTube, I would love to hear your rationale in the comments for this. I run both on a variety of different devices. Generally speaking, if it's 8th generation Intel or older, I'm throwing Linux on it in terms of performance, security, all of those good reasons, and compatibility, because I want a modern operating system that's safe to take online that I can still do work on. If it's newer than 8th generation Intel, and if it has more than 16 gigabytes of RAM, that is another criteria I have. Generally, my machines are running Windows, and that is a limitation of the environments that I have to interact with. So I interact with networks and other people where I need access to either Windows network security protocols, or I need access to specific pieces of software that, yes, I can emulate on Linux, but I just don't have the time to have those systems. Like, I won't snap because that's a terrible thing to do on a podcast, but like that. Like, I just want things to run immediately out of the box without the need to tweak. And I get the sense that those people that are running Linux on really modern hardware, they're either in an ecosystem that allows it, or they're really running their own ecosystem where they don't really need to worry about the others that they're interacting with. But I love MX Linux for older hardware, the XFCE edition. I love Mint for that in-between where you've got enough RAM to run that Cinnamon desktop or operating system. I know that Windows 11 gets a lot of flack for the bloatware, and there are ways that you can reduce that down. But I think we'll also recognize that because of the ubiquity of Windows, that it becomes a necessary evil. So it still runs on my X1 Nano, and it will probably run on the next machine I buy.
Yeah, I can relate to that. It always depends on the kind of applications you need to use for your job and for the things that you need to do, which makes me really grateful that I can choose the utilities I want to use in my workplace. But that's rather an exception than a rule. So it's kind of personal freedom that I'm very grateful for.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too, just to finish that, and I've gotten much better at doing this, is I try to choose software that is platform agnostic. I try to avoid applications that will only run on Windows. If you have a Linux executable, even a Mac, even though I don't run Mac, if you have an executable that you service the big three, Windows, Linux, and Mac, I will pick your software over the one that is exclusive to any other platform.
Very good idea. If you had to choose, would you rather not use ThinkPads at all or just once without a track point? If those are the only two options you would have.
Whoa. So not use ThinkPads at all.
Yeah.
Or what was the track point condition again?
So you need to pick up a new machine, so it can't be a used one, and it could rather be ThinkPad without a track point, because in the near future we only have ThinkPads without track point to set a horror scenario, or you would need to use a notebook that's not a ThinkPad.
Yeah, actually, you know what? This question's actually not that difficult, because there are people that fall in love with ThinkPad that fell in love with different things. They fell in love with the modularity and the repairability, and many of those users have migrated to other platforms in recent years. The framework is the classic example. The framework has never attracted me because it doesn't have a track point.
Same for me.
And track point technology, that's a whole other conversation on the patents and the history and the stories behind that, because like when I talked to Dr. Selker, he really gave me the history of that, and it is fascinating how every other company has handled track point technology, and how IBM and Lenovo handled it. But yeah, the track point has to be on the next computer I buy. Once you have learned to use it, swiping up and down with your fingers multiple times to scroll a page just feels stupid. The idea that I can put in the bare minimum amount of muscle and movement and get everything that I need, and I don't have to leave the home row. And I even the new trackpads that don't have the physical buttons, but they have the haptic ones that Sensol's Technologies built. Those are actually quite good. That the haptic feedback is not a perfect replacement for a button, but I would still take that over a machine without a track point. So yeah, that's an easy question. Track point or bust.
Very good one. So as you have been speaking to a lot of very interesting and influential people on the ThinkPad brand, if you could have interviewed Richard Sapper at his lifetime, what would you have asked him?
Sorry, who?
Richard Sapper.
Oh, Richard Sapper. Man. It's actually a question that I have thought about, because David Hill and I have had quite a few conversations about Richard Sapper, and he's shared a lot of stories about the time that they were able to spend together. If I were to ask him a question, and I've read some of his biographies, so I would avoid some of the questions that I've seen how precisely he would answer. I would probably just ask him, what are you working on now?
Yeah.
And I know that might seem like a really simple answer, but I think that would probably be what I would want to know. What are you working on right now in this moment that you think deserves your attention? Because here's a person, yes, he's got this background of being known for, doing a lot of design work on ThinkPad, but there are very few things that man did not design. And I also got the impression that he wouldn't have worked on something that he didn't feel that he could make a contribution to. And I think just even for a moment to see the world through his lens in that point in time that I would be speaking to him through that question, what is getting your attention right now? What are you excited about? That's what I'd want to know.
That's a very good one. Yeah, I focused a lot on the things that he did in the past. Also, I recorded an episode just about his early works and how he ended up with IBM, and he did a lot of great things. So he did kettle, and he did a coffee maker. Of course, he designed the TCO lamp. I also have one in my collection.
I have one.
And really? Which
Yes.
one? The black one or the silver?
No, I have the black one.
That's a lovely one. I was very, very lucky that from my friends gave this TCO lamp to me at my birthday, and it was just awesome. So it's a very lovely lamp.
That lamp is fun to show people because it's like just move the lamp, just get them to touch it, and then they understand why all the weights work the way they do, and like you can position that lamp in any place, and it'll stay there.
And it's so lovely. It's just black. It's classic. It's timeless, like the ThinkPad design. And you have the red accents that we also see on the ThinkPad design language. And I would be really interested in hear what he would have been up to these days. So I just found out that he died 10 years ago, so on the 31st of December 2015. So was just 10 years ago. And in his book, he mentioned that designing products is more like crafting sculptures to him. And I think that's a very important sentence that gives an impression about how he was thinking about designing and his work.
Yeah, there are two good books. There's the one larger one that's black, and the author escapes me. And then there was a newer one released, I think, 1.5 years ago by Kaz, which is also very, very good. And there's lots of stories in the back pages as well. So if you're listening and you're a Richard Sapper fan, those are two really good books to have in your collection, especially if you're a ThinkPad fan. Lots of good pictures and info in there too.
Definitely. And you will end up in a very, very deep rabbit hole that is called industrial product design, because after reading the book, I have a lot of very special lamps and pens and so on designed by Richard Sapper on my wish list. So maybe speaking of designing a ThinkPad, let's assume you could design a ThinkPad on your own. Ooh. You have a team that would implement all the crazy ideas that you have. Which discarded feature from past ThinkPads would you bring back? So things that aren't part of modern ThinkPads anymore, but that you would like to bring back in a new machine.
All right,
what would it be?
The first thing right off the top of my head, without even thinking, is the ThinkLight.
Yeah, same for me.
I was like, discarded feature, so something that's already been there, that's gone. Yeah, it would without like that. That's the honest, not thinking about it carefully answer would be the ThinkLight. And I understand why keyboard lighting was kind of the quote unquote winner, but the ThinkLight had so much additional utility beyond just lighting up the keyboard. And when everybody that I've spoken to that we talk about the ThinkLight, whether that's David Hill or David Cherbuck, it becomes really clear that feature was, I'm going to use the word, poorly marketed. Yeah. A lot, like it was, if you look for promotional material specific to the ThinkLight, you're going to come up empty-handed. It was not talked about enough, and I think that's one of the reasons that it struggled to find success, because generally in the structure, from what I understand, during the time that the ThinkLight was around, your design team would come up with these ideas, but then your marketing team had some influence on what would kind of go to the next level and actually start making it into production. And I think that there may have been some skepticism over the utility of a ThinkLight. Well, why is no one else making this? Why are they all going with backlit keyboards? Maybe we need to do that too. And to me, like, the really cool machines were like the T430 and X230. You had both.
Yes,
where you had
definitely
the backlit keyboard and the ThinkLight. It's the reason that my X220, I still use it around the house, because I was like, oh, I need some light, just not for where my keys are. Like, I'm a touch typist. I can type in the dark. That's not a problem. But if I have like a document or something, and if you've never sat in a dark room and turned on a ThinkLight, there's an emotion.
Yeah,
there's just the calm, soft white light that it's like I'm kind of isolated. I'm in this little bubble of dark. I've just got my ThinkPad. I've got the light that I need. I can put papers on my keyboard and read everything. It's like low light to vibe to, you know? So yeah, without thinking, it would absolutely have to be the ThinkLight. I know that they tried multiple times to bring back the butterfly keyboard, but aspect ratios, it just didn't become necessary, and it's way too complicated in terms of manufacturing to do it, even though that they have patented about 4 years ago now a new butterfly keyboard. It hasn't been released on a commercial product. So yeah, that'd be the answer. And I don't want them to give up on foldables.
Yeah.
I don't want them to give up on foldables. I know that the X1 Fold, they were still trying to figure that out, but they seem to have shelved that product line for now. Having the opportunity to test the X1 Fold 16, a pre-production sample of it.
Oh, great.
That was cool. And I know it was pretty clear why there were some barriers there as to why it didn't do well and maybe get a Gen 2. But I really, really hope that they don't stop looking at a foldable PC, because I think that they're the company to do it. So yeah, it's kind of my 1.5 answers for you.
I think so too, because we see that other vendors are doing it as well right now. I think at CES there were also foldable screens. I mean, even Lenovo presented a consumer-facing foldable or a foldable screen. So I think as well that there could be a market for that. And I would also go for the ThinkLight, because it's more than just see where you type. It's just you have some very spare light on your table, sitting on your desk in the middle of the night doing some nerdy things. I really miss that one, and I mean, it's no hanging fruit. I mean, it's just 1 or 2 LEDs that need to be put in the display case. Yeah. So that shouldn't be too expensive and too complicated to produce these days.
I think now it would be easier than what it was 4 years ago. And the reason I say that is because, rightly or wrongly, they have added that communications bar to the top of most ThinkPads, and that's where they're putting in these bigger sensors for higher resolution video cameras. So you got the space up there. As you correctly state, we're talking about an LED. You could probably put it on the same board as the camera up there with a piece of software. I think where things might get a little tricky is how flat, because there's no like hook that kind of hangs over anymore where the lid closes for the light to kind of come down. So they'd have to get fancy, I think, with some prisms. And I don't know enough about light to be to say that would work, but it would definitely require a great deal of experimentation. And I fear that the experimentation is for something that, unless you've used it, you don't know that you're missing it. Yeah. And because it perhaps wasn't previously marketed very well, unless you use a ThinkPad that is older than an X230 or older, the history and the knowledge of that experience is going to dwindle to the point where people will no longer ask for it.
Definitely. And I mean, I can remember when I started working in IT, I had an HP EliteBook that was also kind of thin, and there was no place to have the old style ThinkLight, but HP also had something like the ThinkLight, and there was a square button on the display case next to the webcam, and when you pushed it, then it flipped out on maybe 30-40 degrees, and then the LED was shining on your keyboard. So maybe that's something that could be most of the time be inside the display case, and if you push a button then it will flip out. That could be a way to implement it.
Yeah, you might be right on that. I don't know if HP ever patented that design. That would probably be the only barrier.
Yeah. Very interesting. So thanks a lot in participating in this game.
No, I loved it. You fantastic questions.
So maybe we can focus on the topic of that episode, which would be the X300. So as we mentioned more than an hour ago, that the X300 is one of the most important ThinkPads Lenovo ever built. It is considered the very first ultra-portable and power-saving notebook that later became ultrabooks, and very importantly about that variant, it still had an optical drive, which isn't very common these days, and which was really special these days that it still had an optical disk drive, while still having a very low footprint notebook. It was built from February 2008 to something around, if I found out correctly, May 2009. And you have a X300 in your collection. Tell us about it. Which configuration does it have? What condition is it in?
Okay. So I have both an X300 and a 301 in the collection here. I would say that they're in fair condition. Like, these were used machines, but in terms of like all their bits are still in place. Light scratches and fingerprints on the lid, that sort of thing. No cracks in the body or the plastics. I have one of them configured with the optical drive, and thanks to a colleague of mine in Ontario, Mike, years ago, he helped me get an X300 Bay battery. Which is really, really cool. So one of my X300s runs with 2 batteries. Those are pretty hard to come by accessories. The other accessory that goes in that Ultra Bay, of course, is the second SSD, which I have never found, but you could get it. So yeah, I have 2 of them. They're both in pretty modest condition. They're both have a couple of videos on the channel of mods that I've done to them. Obviously the interviews with David Hill as well. But yeah, they're still really cool machines. It's like one of the ones I go down and look at.
Same for me. So I also have a X301 in my collection. It's kind of sticky. I think it was used at a repair center or something like that. But beside that, it works pretty good. And it's a lovely machine. So it's very, very thin. Mm-hmm. And I remember back then, when this machine was new, I went to school, and one of my colleagues from school had one of those machines. And we were so jealous when we saw him every day opening up his X300, because it's such a lovely designed machine, and we all had very kind of cheapo devices from our workplaces, and he had a very good looking ThinkPad.
Yeah, and to illustrate how thin it is, like if you look on the very back of the one that you've got there, you'll notice that the power port is not perfectly round because they had to shave the top and the bottom to get it to fit. And they didn't have the plastics on the top and the bottom of the VGA connector. So it's like they're making this thing as thin as physically possible for the year it's being produced and the I/O that people are expecting to have.
Definitely. So maybe speaking about how thin it is, let's talk a little bit about the hardware facts. So the dimensions, it's 380 by 231 by 23.4 millimeters. So the thickest part is roughly about 2 centimeters thick. That's like not very much. And the weight starts with a 3-cell battery variant at 1.43 kilograms. That's a very lightweight machine for mid-end 2000, I would say. Also, it has a 13.3-inch display with LED backlight and a resolution of 1440 by 900 pixels. It has a soldered Intel Core 2 Duo low voltage CPU. That's a 1.2 gigahertz dual core without hyper-threading. So it's just 2 threads and 4 megabytes of cache, but at least it's a 64-bit capable CPU. So that's okay. And using this machine these days, I would say now we reached a point where even lightweight Linux distributions show you that's a very early ultra low voltage CPU, right?
Yeah, it's not something that I would want to daily drive, regrettably, because like everything else about it, you absolutely could. Like the ports, the port selection is still quite good. Yeah, it's so cool. Yeah, I could just keep going. But yeah, the CPU really lets it down in terms of even the most lightweight of Linux distros running on it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I also have Linux running on one of my machines, and you can feel that the CPU isn't that powerful. But I mean, it's an ultra slim machine. Mm-hmm. And speaking of how thin it is, I think we really need to double point this out. It's so thin, but it still has a modular ultra slim bay with a height of 7 millimeters. You mentioned that you have the battery add-on for it. That's quite rare. By default, this machine comes with an integrated DVD burner, and that's the only machine in ThinkPad history, and as far as I'm concerned, of other vendors as well, that have an optical drive that's that thin. So the manufacturer of the optical disk drive said after that, okay, that's the one and only drive that we made that thin. That's way too complex. We're not going to create further DVD burners for that size form factor.
Yeah, no one else was crazy enough to try it. Like, I have a picture of it somewhere, and if I can find it, I'll share it with you. But it's a side shot of the drive and then a DVD, and just in terms of thickness, like we're talking about something that's like 3 or 4 DVDs thick. Like, it is mind-blowing that it is that thin.
Definitely, yeah. So it's crazy to create a device that's that thin, and they even offered a 7mm height HDD adapter, so you could put another SSD or hard drive into the machine. That's also quite interesting. So interestingly, I hope that I did my research right. I found out that the X300 comes with DDR2 memory, 2 to 8 gigabytes where possible, and that's kind of interesting because at that time when this machine was released, DDR3 was already out there, for example, in the R500, but I think we will cover this later. The X300 work started earlier, there, so maybe 1 or 2 years earlier, and back then DDR2 was the standard to go, right?
Yeah, it kind of had in that way a small issue like the 701C did. It was in development long enough that the technology moved forward, but you don't have the time to retool everything, especially when you're fighting tenths of millimeters of thickness.
Definitely. And speaking of crazy form factors, now we reached a point where we need to talk about the 1.8-inch micro-SATA SSDs. That's a not very common half-length disk format, I would describe it to our listeners, because back then mSATA and NVMe adapters weren't there yet. They are available these days, so you could get an adapter to get an mSATA SSD into that machine. You covered this also in your video about the machine, but back then that was the crazy standard to go.
Yeah, it was definitely something that drove up the cost of the machine, I think, going with a non-standard drive. But I think for the customer, it wasn't a huge selling point one way or the other. They just saw, I can get all of this in this package, sign me up, or I don't need it.
Yeah. I mean, there have been other X-series machines in the ThinkPad lineup that also had that crazy form factor. I remember the X40 series also has a 1.8-inch hard drive. I mean, it's IDE, not micro SATA, but those drives were ridiculously slow and hard to get. And a lot of people wanted to have adapters. And I mean, at least they went for an SSD instead of a spinning Rust drive, because this would have made the machine even slower, I would say.
No, it could use all the help it could get to be the ultralight, low voltage portable that it was.
Definitely. Besides that, we have USB 2.0, audio in and out, we have Bluetooth, gigabit Ethernet, wireless LAN, and optionally also Wii. We run card if you want to. We have a webcam, we have the ultra nav, the track point, and of course also the optional fingerprint sensor. So all the good stuff packed into a very small footprint. And of course we have a white ThinkLight. And as you mentioned in your interview, David Hill said that a lot of people dislike the orange ones. So a very good idea that they went for the white ones for the X300, I would say.
I think that was also a very important moment that showcased that the X300 was not a compromise machine. And like this was going to come up, I think, at any point in our conversation about this, that the X300 was the very first ThinkPad that Lenovo was in charge of designing and producing. Like they had built other machines, but they were running off of IBM oversought designs. And the X300 was their first time out to be like, okay, you are building this ThinkPad. IBM is long gone. What are you going to do? And everybody is watching. Investors are watching. The marketing and companies that work with Lenovo and used to work with IBM are watching very carefully. And you've also got essentially an old team, but it's also brand new in the sense that they have a new set of corporate structure sitting over top of them. And that, from the people I've spoke to, that was a very significant shift. So the fact that a amber light wasn't even considered is one of those really small, you could argue insignificant moments, but it's actually very significant that Lenovo wasn't like, oh, well, we want the low-cost one too. Like, that conversation didn't happen. Like, they were working on ultraviolet prototypes, and that they couldn't get them working, but they were going in the opposite direction. We're not looking at how do we cut costs. We're looking at how can we build the best, smallest computer that people have ever seen.
Definitely. And I mean, we have a lot of highlights in that machine. So as we mentioned several times, it's a very thin machine that still has an optical drive. That's a highlight because no other machine after that and the X301 had an optical drive in that size. It's the first ThinkPad with an SSD as far as I'm concerned, and it's also the first ThinkPad with an LED backlit screen. So a lot of highlights, and as you mentioned, the X300 was going to be a non-compromise ThinkPad. Go big or go home was the motto, I would say, when they designed that one.
Mm-hmm.
And they did so with an internal project that started with the name Project Kodashi.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you have a lot of experience to share about that one. That was the internal code name and the project that started that ended up with the X300s. And I think they changed the name several times, right?
That's right. They first started out with the name Razer, oddly enough. I think they were, and this was an internal name. This wasn't something that was going to be like shared as a product, but they hadn't acquired Motorola at this time. But the Razer phone was, I believe, floating around the market at that point, and I think they saw it and they're like, well, that's kind of what we want to go for, because the Razer was thin, but it was still a phone that did everything that a phone had to do. But they didn't like the idea of using an internal code name that was a product at another company, so they scrapped it. And then they went with Katana, and they were like, oh, we got the same problem. I think Suzuki made a motorbike called the Katana, so they didn't want to do that either. And they settled on Kodachi, which is the shorter sword in Japanese culture. So the Katana is a little longer, a Kodachi is a little shorter. And they're like, well, that works because it's going to be thin, but it also is going to be probably smaller. So that is kind of how they settled on the name. And again, a lot of that is detailed in Steve Ham's book. So it's one of the many reasons why you should go read it.
Definitely. I was just wondering, because I know you're also into mechanical keyboards, because you have some of those videos about keyboards on your YouTube channel. And there's this company called Tex, and they also create mechanical keyboards that have a lot of ThinkPad DNA in their design. Yep. So I'm also a proud owner of one of those keyboards, which is the Tex Shura.
Oh,
That's
yes.
60% keyboard with a track point. And funny enough, they also have a Tex Kodashi keyboard. And I was just wondering whether this is related to the X300 and they picked it up in their naming maybe.
You'd have to ask them, but I suspect that, I don't know, you'd have to look at the year it was produced. I suspect that they're probably aware of that story, or somebody over there is aware of that story, because they could have called it the Katana, but they didn't.
Yeah.
They specifically went after that name. So, but I also think that we're talking about a very niche group of people that would know Kodachi as well. So I suspect that there is not a coincidence that there's probably a connection. I've seen those keyboards over the years. The one thing I've always wondered, and since you own one, I'm going to ask you a question. How do you find the regular switches for your mouse buttons for the track point? Does that work out okay?
That's a good question, because I ordered the DIY variant. So mechanical keyboards can be a very daunting hobby if you are living in Germany and you would want to use a German keyboard layout.
Yes.
So the most keyboard enthusiasts simply go for the ANSI layout or the QWERTY layout. And I would say, very special in that regards, that I want to have a German layout on all of my keyboards. So I have something around 10 to 15 keyboards, I would say. And every keyboard has the German layout. And speaking of the Tex keyboards, you can either get the German layout with soldered switches, which I do not want to have because I like to tinker around with various switches. So you would need to get the DIY variant, where you can simply click on the switches that you want to have. But you can't get that one with a German keyboard layout.
Oh.
And this drove me nuts for several years. And then someone told me, "What's your problem, Christian? Just go ahead and write an email and ask whether they can make a special offer to you." And I was like, okay, maybe I can try that. And I sent an email, and funny enough, maybe 24 hours later, I got an answer. Yeah, sure, that's no question, that's no problem. Just drop an order and give me your order number, and then I will give you the German layout keycaps with your DIY variant. And then I ordered it. So
awesome.
Very, very good experience with that shop. So the standard switches of those machines, I think you can select between the normal ones, so black, blue, brown, and red. It depends on what kind of typist you are. Are you more focusing on typing only, or do you also game from time to time?
Yeah, I do both. But I was just wondering, because like you and I are probably so used to a certain amount of travel as well with track point buttons, and I was wondering if that was like a barrier, that the fact that this is essentially, well, it is a keyboard switch, and I know you can customize them, but like, is it something that you're like, it's not quite right, or have you gotten used to it?
So the normal switches that Tex offers are Sherry switches. Sherry switches are pretty good switches if you start the hobby, I would say, very politely. Of course, this is always a question of your own taste. So I know a lot of keyboard enthusiasts that still use keyboards with Sherry switches, and that's totally fine. I really like to have a very, very hard tactile bump. So I think if I would have been born 30 years earlier, I would have been a very big user of typewriters, because it's a feeling from a typewriter that I would like to have on my keyboard. So the normal Sherry switches have an actuation force of something around 40 to 60 grams, and I have switches with nearly 70 grams of actuation force.
Those are pretty heavy.
Pretty heavy, but I really like that one. And I just ordered during Christmas. I ordered a modern remake of an IBM Model F keyboard, if you know that one.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's a modern variant that looks like Model M. So it has a modern layout with function keys and the Windows button, but it has the good old buckling springs from Model F, and it has a solenoid from typewriters.
Yeah, so you get that massive clack sound.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a keyboard that has a weight of 3 kilograms, has a very heavy metal case, and it also makes noises like a typewriter from the 60s.
Wow.
Yeah. So, how did we get there?
I derailed you when we were talking about the history of the name of the X300.
Oh yeah, yeah, and that's totally fine. I like being derailed to talk about mechanical keyboards. That's another rabbit hole I went down a couple of years ago. So yeah, we do not know whether the Tex Kodashi keyboard is related to that one. Maybe that's something I could ask the owner of the shop at some time. But you already mentioned that that's one of the most important ThinkPads ever made by Lenovo, because, as you said, it's considered one of the first big achievements since Lenovo bought the ThinkPad line by IBM in 2005. And I think the idea of that project was to show the world what Lenovo was capable of doing, right?
That's a huge part of it, I think, because let's be real, if the X300 came out and it failed, would there have been any more ThinkPads? Like, that's the real question that I have. And that it's one of those key moments where it's like, geez, I don't know. I think that might have scared people away from the new owner of this product or this brand. And it wasn't a laptop that they designed to sell loads of units. It was very much a Halo product in the sense that, like, we are going to show you what we can do. And I think a huge part of that was Lenovo had a very different attitude than IBM did toward the end of their ownership, where they're already thinking, every time we do something, this is just costing us more money and making this more difficult to sell to somebody else. And that's an understandable posture from a business perspective. It's not a very great posture to be a customer. So they really, really had to get it right. And the amount of design and focus that came from that machine, if you look at all the product lines after the X300, I would argue that a good majority of them have X300 DNA in them somewhere. Some of it is very obvious, others is a lot more subtle.
So it was really a no compromise machine, I would say. I just had a look at one of the test reviews from that time, so we will cover that later because we collected some of the voices about that. But we can see in the pricing, so back then in 2008, this machine costed about 300-600 US dollars. So in terms of inflation, that would be 5,400 US dollars these days, or for our German listeners, nearly 4,700 euros. That's like a lot. I mean, for that price, I don't know whether I can bump up my ThinkPad configuration to go that high. Maybe if I pick a P series and I put in 128 gigs of RAM or something like that. But that was not a cheap machine back then, I would say.
No, and Lenovo pricing has always been a bit fluid, so that might be the highest price that it ever sold for, but we can probably say with a great deal of confidence that they were selling machines for under that before too long.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, those were prices when the machine was released, and if you wait a couple of months, then usually those prices go down, and Lenovo also has some special offers from time to time. So my daily driver at home is a P14G3 AMD, and I think I bought that 3 years ago before Christmas, and I had a 800 euro discount code available on the Lenovo website. So I think usually those prices aren't that high anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe let's focus on when Project Kodashi started. And as far as I'm concerned, they started less than 2 years earlier, right? So the time to market wasn't that high like for the Butterfly ThinkPad, but it was nearly two years.
Yeah, it was quite the development cycle, from what I understand. And like any product and design team, you're designing like several products all concurrently. You're not just being like, I'm only working on building this one machine for 2 solid years. You have to build multiple product lines. But that isn't to say that the X300 wasn't a very special and important machine, because it's not like they were going to completely reinvent the wheel with like the T series, the X series, etc. But there were a couple of machines where it's like, no, we have to focus on this because it's either a brand new kind of machine, or we're starting a new product category like the W series, for example, which is kind of replacing the A and the G series, those larger workstation behemoths, with another workstation behemoth. But yeah, it was obviously quite clear that this was something that they had in the work for a while. And I think even on the final product, you can see some of the stuff that survived early versions. Like, to my knowledge, and I'm shooting from the hip here, it's the only ThinkPad outside of the S30, and I don't even think the S30 had it, that has piano black hinges and a piano black bezel around the display. And I think those are actually leftovers, that because at some point they were looking at having a piano black or a Mirage black lid, and they got rid of it because it was going to be too difficult to manufacture. But the bezels on some of these machines and the hinges are piano or Mirage black. And I think that they probably already had them built. And they're like, well, we're not going to retool the hinges and the display bezel because that's just going to cost money. So they're still aware of that, but they're like, it also doesn't look bad either to have these like really shiny piano black hinges. But it is one of those things that you can kind of see how long this took. If it was designed over a short period of time, I think that we wouldn't have these little pieces of history that still made it on the launch machines.
Definitely. I really like that those display hinges are piano black, because they give this device an even more special look. So it looks very interesting, I would say, very, very mystic. We don't know what we will see if we open up the display lid and then we see this piano black Lenovo logo. So it's not too much, because I'm not a big fan of glossy piano black, to be honest. And
it's terrible.
I know the S30 also was available for a short time in piano black, and I also have the SL series devices in my collection, so the SL300, 400, and 500. And boy, they are so glossy that you see every fingerprint. It's really, really hard to keep those devices good looking. So that's just the right amount of piano black, I would say, on the X300.
Yes, I'm very glad that even a special edition was not made with a piano black top, because we still haven't quite figured out the absolute perfect way to make a scratch resistant piano black, just because of how reflective or refractive that material is, the acrylic. So yeah.
So when the X300 was designed, David Hill worked together with, and I hope that I pronounce it correctly, Tomoyuki Takahashi, I would say. That's one of the designers at Lenovo.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they really did a great job. So the design is very, very special. And the former plan was to sell 130,000 units in 12 months, but they only could sell 60,000 units in accordance with the research that somebody did, because it's a kind of a niche product. I don't know, do we have any numbers how many machines were actually sold during the whole lifetime of the X300 series? It's hard to get those information these days, I'm afraid.
Yes, to my knowledge, those numbers are not published. I don't know how accurate those numbers would be. I don't know the source. Usually things like that sometimes will leak out, and it has a monochrome of accuracy. We know, again, that it wasn't a product that they expected to sell in large volume. Like 130,000 units is not a large amount, even for Lenovo at the very beginning in 2008 when it was released. So to move that many units is still not bad. And it's not about who owned one, it's about the fact that it was out there in the press. That machine got was mission critical, I think, for Lenovo and the future of the ThinkPad brand. That it's like, okay, you know what? I don't need that machine. I don't want it. But the fact that you built it and it doesn't fall apart immediately, which the real enthusiasts are worried about, they were getting information about like the screws and where the paint was being manufactured, and like everything was being so heavily scrutinized by those devices that, yeah, it doesn't matter if a whole lot of people bought it. What matters is that they made it and they didn't screw it up.
Definitely, yeah. Is there any part of the design that you appreciate the most?
Well, let's see.
I'm also having a look at mine right now. I really like the keyboard, to be honest, because it has a very, very nice touch, and it has a very good amount of key travel that's decreased over the last years, I would say, for the most of the ThinkPads. I don't know whether this machine still has 1.7 or 1.8 millimeters of key travel, but it feels very high quality, and it's fun typing on it.
Yes, the kind of paint that they used it felt more premium than everything else that Lenovo and IBM was using at the time. I would say one of the small features that stands out to me is actually the lid and hinge mechanism, because I think this was one of the first thinner ThinkPads. I don't know if it was the very, very first ThinkPad that you could open with one hand. So when it's sitting on the desk, you can disengage the latch, lift the lid, and the computer itself will stay in place and not lift up off the desk. And it just closes with a very premium click. And for our ASMR friends, I'm just going to put this up to my microphone.
That's lovely.
Like, what a sound.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, they managed to have this kind of closing mechanism for a device that's that thin, because later models didn't have this mechanism anymore. And that's also one of the features that I would like to bring back to newer ThinkPads, because we covered it in one of the questions. And yeah, I can totally relate. That's very satisfying to hear. Very nice. Yeah, I really like the machine. Also, I like that they put the privacy button on the back of the machine for the wireless networking.
Yes.
And I like the very small detail that you also shared, that the power port needed to be trimmed down, that it fits the low footprint of the machine. That's a very, very, very tiny detail. That's very lovely.
Yeah, but again, it shows an attention to detail, because we're talking about a part that is universal on a ThinkPad, is the power port. But they felt it was important enough to the design of the machine to shave the top and the bottom and produce a custom part where they didn't really have to, but somebody cared enough to do it. So, I don't know. It might seem silly, but I can imagine 5 or 6 people around the table, designers, material engineers, product engineers, and they're like, okay, we got 2 options here. We can make the chassis thinner and go with a full circular port, and it's going to do all of this, or we take the existing part, we do a cast of the mold, and we produce a specific power plug for the X300. It's going to cost this much money, but it's going to do this, and it's going to do this, and it's going to do this. And then rather than being like, we're going to go with the cheaper option, somebody said, no, this is important. We're going to do this. Yeah,
definitely. I highly appreciate that kind of enthusiasm and going big and make this ThinkPad really outstanding. I also like that if we have it closed in front of ourselves, then we see that the status icons are on the left. So usually they can't be seen at all, and they are part on the left side of the screen. And you can see there whether the machine is in standby, whether the power supply has been added, or the battery is running low. That's a very nice detail.
Yep. And then you also had like on the top case, it would say like what ports were on the side. So you didn't have to look to see where your USB ports was. There was a little indicator that tells you right on the top bezel.
You're right. Yeah, yeah.
Plug stuff in.
totally forget about that. That's also pretty good, yeah. A very lovely machine. Yeah, so maybe speaking of how other people's like that machine, I think the voices out there where had the same opinion like we two guys have. The design was considered to be a revolution at its time.
Mm-hmm.
And you cover this in one of your videos. So Richard Zappa once said in an interview, if the design doesn't respect the function, then it's a mistake. But if a product only has this function of being functional and it doesn't have some formal impression that wakes your interest if you look at it, that helps creating a human relation between you and the product, it's not a good design. And I think they did a very good job for the X300 because I can look at this machine for 5 minutes and I still like looking at it because there are so many details that are just lovely put in the right place.
Yeah, like people will not look at a T60 and have that same conversation.
No, not really. And yeah, I can totally see why they want to go big with that machine because it's the first ThinkPad that had to be a success after Lenovo bowed out the PC computing line, because otherwise people wouldn't have trusted that Lenovo can make awesome ThinkPads as well.
Yep, huge.
Did you have a chance to have a look at the S70 prototype that exists of the X300?
Yeah, we've actually, over the years, exchanged a couple of emails because when I was looking at the X300, I was made aware that he had one of the S70 prototypes.
Oh.
So we've talked maybe once or twice over the years. Really, really kind person. And he actually sent me a couple of extra photographs and things for my use of his S70 model. And it's on his S70 model. You can see a lot of the stuff that they wanted to do, they almost got to do, but then they either dropped or had to phase out. Like some of the port covers, I think on the S70 prototype you see didn't make it, although they would come back on the X1. The X1, I think, has pretty much all of its ports covered behind little doors and flaps, and that was very much something that Sapper was pushing for. He didn't want the X300 to look like a computer when it was closed. That was one of the things that he wanted to make this object rather timeless by doing that. So yeah, there were a couple of things on that S70 prototype that were different, but it was also pretty far along because it's functional. Like you'll have models and prototypes that are not functional that would look much more different than the finished product. But once you have a prototype or a pre-production model that has a board in it that turns on, you're not really going to be changing the board and kind of a lot of the case parts at that point. It is interesting, though, that they called it the S70 because it really tells you how late they were in deciding that this is going to be part of the X line and it's going to be a 300 series machine, and how all those decisions kind of came toward the end. And I do wonder, I don't know, but I do wonder if they called it an S because it originally was going to have those piano black parts, and the last machine to have all the piano black parts was the S30, and then the SL line, and well, the SL line was kind of made concurrently for the most part. But I think it might have been a callback to that, where they were still using 2-digit numbers. But then, of course, when that series of machines came out, they were all 3-digit numbers. And I think they also did that to help differentiate between this is a Lenovo machine that's been Lenovo developed versus the IBM era, which is all 2-digit. Again, I can't confirm that, but it seems to make sense.
It definitely makes sense because, as you mentioned, the S30 with the glossy piano black design and the maybe an idea of having the whole machine in a piano black, that totally would make sense that it would be part of the S series. And I mean, revitalizing or faint model series is something the ThinkPad brand is known for. Yeah, as you mentioned, the Z series, for example. Yeah, but did you had a chance to have your hands on one of those prototype machines? Because they are pretty rare.
The only one that I know of is the one that Exos has. I've never seen another one, not photographed online. and understanding what often happens to pre-production and prototype devices, one of two things happens to them. They are either scrapped, or they used to. It probably happens a lot less now. They were, and this is true of some machines, definitely in the early days, they would be put out on tables for people just to take home.
Wow, okay.
At least that's the rumor that I've heard. That
Yeah.
these machines would be like, yeah, just take them, keep them, don't try and sell them. Like there would be some like stipulations, but it was they went out into the wild, and I'm pretty sure that's cracked. They've cracked down on that significantly since then. But there was a time, I think, where they were just taken home because they were going to be scrapped anyway, and there might have been even a few that, like, well, once it's in the scrap bin, no one's going to check. They're just heaving these things into a crusher. They're not going to count every single machine that goes into a crusher and be like, oh, this serial number's missing, we better go look. No, they don't care. So, yeah. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if Exos's example is the only one that's still out there.
Interesting. Because during the research for this episode, I found a video on YouTube of a young person that gives also an overview about the S70 prototype and has one in his hands. And I was like, wow, those machines still exist. So maybe that machine was given to that person by a family member that worked at Lenovo or something like that. It's hard to find out where the machine come from. But I think those machines are pretty hard to get because only 425 were assembled and distributed within the company, as you mentioned. And they did some testing. So I heard this in your video about the machine, that it was possible to assemble this machine in 25 steps just in 10 minutes. So you have all the parts on your desk, and in 10 minutes you have a working machine. That's quite interesting for such a complex device.
It is. I think they actually did that as part of a demo at CES when they announced it. I want to say that I remember one of their demo guys might have done that, and I think they blogged about it. I think that was something that actually did happen. And it was something that they featured in some of the promotional material, like the cover story of Business Week that featured the X300, featured it disassembled. Which was an interesting choice because you wouldn't necessarily immediately recognize it for what it is. But that was the cover picture that they went with, was the machine disassembled. So they were pretty proud of that too. They could throw pretty much the whole chassis together so quickly.
Yeah. There are some other differences between the prototype and the final product. Are there some things that you can share with our listeners that might be interesting?
Yeah, a lot of stuff that they wanted to do on the X300 we saw later. There were some things that didn't make it. I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the ThinkLight that they were going to use a luminescent paint on the keycaps. So when the ThinkLight turned on, it would actually light up the keys on the keyboard. They didn't go with it, probably because either they couldn't get it to work right, or they couldn't get it to work well enough for it to be a viable solution. Or the cost of the special super awesome paint would have been poor, or maybe the durability of the paint was going to be problematic, because if it's like you have to seal the keycap with the paint underneath, but as soon as you do that, the light's not going to get through, who knows. So they had things like that. We talked about all the piano black components that they were going to have, how the ports were going to be like concealed and covered, and they would kind of do that on the X1. They were originally going to have the red LED light on the eye of ThinkPad light up on the X300, but that got pushed down the roadmap, but it was originally slated for the X300.
Interesting, because they did it for the SL series. That's where I saw it the very first time. I mean, nowadays all the ThinkPads have that feature.
Yep.
But the first one was the SL series, because right at the time in school where my colleague, or one of my colleagues, had the X300, another colleague had the SL300, which is all piano black, but it had that blinking eye on the ThinkPad logo.
Yeah, and I think they had more room to do it in that machine. It wasn't a non-issue.
Yeah.
It was a non-issue, right? Whereas in this thing, it's like, where do we put it is a part of the actual problem. Whereas on the
Yes.
SL series, you've got room. And yeah, that whole ThinkPad light, that pulsing, breathing LED is it's a very persistent design choice that is very iconic, and I know David is quite proud of it, as he should be. So we had that, which was pushed to other models until they found a way to build it slim enough, and I think it also became part of the brand identity. So it's like, well, if you're going to have a ThinkPad, the expectation is that that light lights up, and it also tells you the status of the computer in a very humanistic way. It's not an indicator with the moon anymore like it used to be on the old models. Yeah. It's this, oh, it's breathing like it's like quietly sleeping, like you understand it without being told. And if it's blinking, it's like shutting down, and if it's off, then it's off, and if it's on, then you know it's on. So yeah, I'm sure that there was probably a lot of research that went into that, but it just didn't make it onto the X300, probably due to space and the time. Because if they came up with the idea when they've already tooled up the case, it's too late, right? And that's just an issue with product design in general. You can come up with the best idea, but you came up with it too late, so it's got to wait until the next product. So yeah, it had the rubber port covers, things like that. There was a product at the time being developed that I don't think was this machine, but they were trying to find a way to, at that time, bring back the track-right keyboard that Dr. John Caritas invented. But again, too complicated. It's not meeting that need of how do I get a keyboard which is this aspect ratio into a display that's a 4:3. Like, we don't have to solve that problem anymore, so why are we spending a lot of money solving a problem that doesn't exist? So even though it's beautiful and it captures everybody's attention, and there was a lot of excitement about when the patent for the new one came out, outside of a specific instance, I couldn't imagine where that would be applicable. I thought it would be on a foldable, actually, because of the aspect ratio issues there. Have a full-size keyboard on a foldable like the X1 Fold. But again, didn't make it to production. And then I know that in the original they were only going to have one speaker, and they're like, no, we gotta have two speakers, because speakers were becoming a more important part of the design. And this is a small thing, but I'll illustrate it by pulling out my example here. They had to strategically place the speakers here because they didn't want to repeat a mistake they made. I think it was with the either ThinkPad 570 or 600, where the speaker was right where you put your palm.
Definitely, yeah.
So it's like, well, how do we balance that? And if you place your hands on the keyboard deck on this, with the intent of using the track point especially, your hands are free and away from the speakers. So thankfully, that is a change they were able to slip in there. But yeah, I think those are the big highlights.
Yeah, I mean, it's just fascinating how many hardware they put in that very small footprint, and even have stereo speakers. Because I think it would have been the wrong decision only to go for mono speakers. And those speakers are really, really small. So
yes,
you only see them if you have a very detailed look at the palm rest, and they are not very outstanding in terms of that you will see them in the first place. So they are black, and they are just looking like they are part of the design.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very intentional. They're not part that's supposed to stand out. You just expect it to be there. Exactly.
And they had some problems with the SSD during the product design phase, right?
I believe they did. They had a lot of reliability issues with that. There was some issues with the Centrino modem. Yes, and again, I'm going to point back to Ham's book because he goes into great detail on all of the little bumps that they ran into on the X300, but yes, there were quite a few issues with several hardware manufacturers at the time to get that thing running reliably, and that's to be expected. Like, you are pulling off the shelf these really thin, cutting edge components. Like, these aren't components that have been around for a long time. These are things that are being developed in niche batches. Like, we should be probably surprised that there isn't issues with the super slim DVD drive, because if you think about the R&D that went into it and the amount that the company produced, I want to say it was Hitachi that built the drive. That's not a large volume of drives to test for reliability. So when you're building all these customized parts, or when you're using these parts from vendors that are not often used, you're introducing a bit of risk, especially when it's outside of your supply chain.
Definitely. So let's focus on how the machine was received out there, and let's start with a phrase that Richard Zappa said during an interview. He said, "It is so thin it shocks you," and I would definitely agree on that. That's like the thinnest ThinkPad I saw back then. And he also said it has a striking appearance. It's a classical box design in a very thin footprint, and I would say that they really did a great job on that. And in January 2008, that's 1 month before the X300 was released, a leak was published on Gizmodo. And yes, you can hear that we are on a retro computing podcast because we're talking about Gizmodo. Nobody talks about Gizmodo these days anymore. Yeah, that was a very popular blog back then who focused on technical information. So somehow a leak was published on that website, and the reactions on the internet were very strong, and the exposure of the X300 was excellent, I would say. So maybe we can start with some opinions that some magazines had, and I will start with Notebook Review. They wrote the X300 is much more practical than the pretty but port challenged MacBook Air. We will focus on that soon. But what did Digital Trends and PC World Australia say about the machine? So Digital Trends said, while Apple had to make a number of compromises on the Air to get it down to its remarkable size, Lenovo took the opposite approach and have crammed as many features as possible, including an optical disk drive, into the X300. And that's very good sentence about how they designed the X300, because they really did the opposite. They did not want to slim down, they want to go big and have everything that's needed in that machine. Lastly, PC World Australia, I will quote them, "The X300 is not a cheap notebook, but it only costs the sum of the components it offers, so you're getting what you pay for." And I think that's also good to point that out, and maybe we forgot that earlier, that when the X300 was released, and Arimasa Naito said this once during an interview, that the machine offered cutting-edge technology, and it was still too expensive because it was released during a financial crisis and recession. So that's also maybe one of the reasons why the machine was not a commercial winner in that regards.
That's very true. If it had not been released during a recession, would the numbers have been higher? Thankfully, I think the impact remained unchanged, because we still had people talking about this machine a lot. If it was released earlier and maybe the internet wasn't as developed and people couldn't exchange information as freely as they could even back then, I think that would have been a much bigger problem.
Definitely. And you already mentioned the Business Week February release 2008 had a cover story about the X300 by Steve Ham, and he later dedicated a whole book on that machine. So I think he has a lot about the machine to say, and we're happy that he covered all the stuff in a book.
Yeah, Steve Ham is a phenomenal guy. I was really thankful I actually got to sit down and talk to him, not only about that book, but a couple of other books that he's written, and yeah, kind of informed me about a few things that were just important about like journalistic style that I've tried to take away from. So very very appreciative of his time all those years ago to talk to me to like what it was like to have that opportunity, because he had all these NDAs signed. So he was talking to everybody about anything that he wanted to. And I can't think of a book like it since.
I really need to get that one for my collection.
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell him in the comments, everybody. Go get the book.
Yeah, definitely. It's available from time to time on the usual places in the internet, but I think there are no reprints available. So you need to get old copies of it by these days.
Yeah, I think you can get it digitally too, but there is something nice about a paper copy.
Same for me. So I really like to have books in paper form and sitting on my couch while having the tissue lamp over me
Yes.
and reading the book. Yeah, so I think we can summarize the X300 got the feedback the team has hoped for, and they really did a good job.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, when we have a look at the media back then a lot of misconceptions were that the X300 was considered a MacBook Air killer, but that's not true, right?
No, not at all. It was a very easy thing for journalists to say at the time because of the release of both of these machines, and both of them were thin and light, what would become Ultrabook computers. So the comparison was inevitable, and it was so important that it's actually how Steve Ham opens the book with them talking about what it was like to be in the Lenovo office when they're seeing this keynote by Steve Jobs dropping the MacBook Air, and their first thought was, does ours fit in an inter-office envelope? And it did. And I actually have a picture from David's collection of the envelope that they stuffed it in as a point, and even where I display this on a shelf, I have an inter-office envelope right next to it, and people will say, why is there an envelope next to that computer? And it's like, well, let me tell you.
Let that you ask. Let me tell you in the next 40 minutes the story behind it.
Yeah. Yeah, but what a story. But yeah, the MacBook Air is a technical achievement. I will not rob Apple of that pinnacle moment of their history. That brought back the idea that laptops don't have to be constantly plugged in, that they do have mobility and they have function and purpose and all that good stuff. But yeah, it was a very interesting time. The media, I think, elevated the X300 because it was the only machine, really, to combat the MacBook Air. Like, there wasn't anything else that anybody else compares the original MacBook Air to. It is always the X300. And it's for good reason.
Yeah. But I mean, it totally makes no sense that 1 month after Apple released the very first MacBook Air, Lenovo comes up with an MacBook Air clone in form of the X300, because how would they design a machine in that short time? Or maybe when they started 6 months earlier, they wouldn't have made a machine that's that awesome. So that was a very low-hanging fruit for journalists to pick on that, and it's a common misconception, as you just pointed out.
Yes, one that over the almost 10 years that I've been running the YouTube channel, I have to constantly remind people, and it's like, no, this machine was long in development before we knew about the MacBook Air. Now, were both of these machines probably started designed around the same time period? That I can certainly believe. But yeah, Lenovo was still brand new to PC manufacturing. Let's say, for sake of argument, that this rumor was actually true and they were able to produce the X300 in that short amount of time, which they did not. But let's say that they did. That still says more about Lenovo's ability to produce a computer than it does Apple, because that means that they had the answer to Apple's question in a matter of months, which they didn't. Yeah. But even if they did, we can't stop and be like, oh, well, it's not impressive because if that were even true. It's like, no, if that were true, it would almost be more impressive.
Definitely.
if you stop and think about it.
Yeah. So maybe just to summarize what the first MacBook Air looked like in comparison with the X300. As you mentioned, it was announced by Steve Jobs as the thinnest notebook in the world. It also had the 13.3-inch display, but with a lower resolution of 1280 by 800. We had soldered memory, 2 gigabytes of DDR2 memory. So the X300 had the better memory option by going up to 8 gigabytes. The CPU was more powerful because it was an Penguin-style Intel Core 2 Duo non-ULV CPU. But it also had the 1.8-inch hard disk drive or SSD, so you could also get that one with spinning Rust at these days. We had Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, micro DVI. That support I do not miss these days. No. Very, very special form factor.
Yep.
We had audio out, but only one USB port. It was 70 grams lighter and something around 4 millimeters thinner. But I think it was designed for a different audience. So if you just want to have a sleek device that you can put on your backpack and go wherever you want to carry your PC with, that's a fine machine. But for the professional user, you have very different requirements. So you want to have a variety of ports and standards that you would see in corporate setups and so on, which led into that Lenovo did several advertisements about the machine. I think the most prominent one is a parody of the Apple MacBook Air announcement. We will link that in the show notes for our listeners, but during the announcement of the MacBook Air, I think it was also shown right after Steve Jobs showed the device, then you could see that envelope that you just mentioned, and somebody is putting out the MacBook Air and opening it with one hand, and it's a very thin device, but it lacks all the ports that business users like. So Lenovo did a parody, and I really like that the music is nearly the same of the Apple clip. Yeah,
it definitely has the same feel, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's really, really very much the same, I would say. And of course, they're opening an envelope with the MacBook Air, and then they put in USB hub with a lot of devices and USB stick and optical drive and so on. And then the person tries to put all that stuff back in the envelope, so the notebook and the adapter and the hub. And of course, he completely destroys it by that. Mm-hmm. And then they have a second big envelope on the desk, and they pull out an X300. And they have all the ports and optical drive, and they have a text mark, the no compromise, ultra portable, we don't add stuff on. And I think that's kind of active aggressive rather than passive aggressive, I would say.
Yeah, I think they understood what they had, and I think they understood their customer. And the other part that I wonder, at that time, and again, like, neither one of these machines would have been in my price bracket at the time they were being released. But I also wondered that when, like, journalism is making this comparison, but are consumers actually making that comparison? Because I feel like if you're going to buy a MacBook, you're going to buy a MacBook. And if you're going to buy a Windows laptop, then you're going to buy anything over here. So I feel a lot of that comparison was manufactured by media. I don't know how many people were actually being like, oh, do I buy a MacBook Air or do I buy the X300? I think that was certainly played up. But yeah, you're absolutely right that they did a very good job of showcasing all the stuff that Apple chose to leave out for the market they were targeting. That Lenovo was like, no, we're actually gonna work, in their mind, they're working harder to leave it in.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite clips, to be honest. So one older clip that I really always have in mind is, it's not an advertisement, it's a recording that shows a Lenovo salesperson. I think it's part of a meeting at a big customer site. So he has a T61P with an aluminum case behind the display, and he has this 500 grams metal boule ball that you would use to play the boule game. And then he just lists down the specs of the T61P and the display cage and why it's so awesome. And then he simply puts the machine on the floor and takes his 500 gram boule ball, let it crush on the floor. And it's very loud, of course, because it's a heavy ball. And then he does the same on the display. and nothing happens. And then the video ends with, when you go to buy your next computer, don't forget the boule ball. Yeah, of course, I'm going to a retail market with the boule ball and let it crush on all the notebooks.
That reminds me, this did happen, but there's no clip of it on the internet, but it has to do with the X300. There was, and I know about this from David Cherbuck, there was a broadcast on an American news network where the CEO of Lenovo had the X300, and he was talking about the spill-proof keyboard. And the host of this interview segment was like, "Can we try it?" And what he did is he took his water bottle, which was I think 2/3 full, and he like dumped the whole thing. Not just like a little bit, like he dumped the whole thing on the keyboard. And I guess the CEO was like, I thought you were just going to spill some water on it, not give it a drink. And it still worked. And unfortunately, that clip no longer exists, because I actually reached out to the outlet that did the interview, and they said that they no longer had the tape. Whether or not they were just telling that to me, but it's no longer accessible at the very least. But it is a fun kind of media piece that has been mostly lost, except for the story.
Yeah, we really need to create backups of those awesome advertisements, because there were many IBM and Lenovo advertisements back then that were just very, very funny.
Mm-hmm.
So in summary, I think we pointed that out in the last 2 hours that the X300 is a lovely device. It has a very slim form factor and the quality is also pretty good. Even though I read that some models have problems with the base cover though. So if the display hinges are too hardly screwed during the manufacturing process, then the parts around the display hinges could break. Did this happen with one of your devices? I only heard about it on the internet that some of those machines have problems with it.
Yes, you and I have probably heard it in the same place, and I have not experienced the issue, but I can certainly understand why people would experience the issue. And the issue is primarily on the right-hand side of the machine where the Kensington lock slot is.
Ah.
And you can see that when that hinge opens, if the hinge is too stiff, or if the hinge is not doing exactly what it needs to, that there's nothing to stop that piece from flexing because of where the bezel sits. The bezel's not connected to the bottom cover.
Mm-hmm.
And that can cause the machine to flex. And I have seen the flex, but I've never seen the break. But I can understand where that might occur. Looking at the X300 and 301 side by side, actually I'm going to take that back. I think there is a very small tooling difference between the 300 and 301, where they might have reinforced the case just a little bit differently. It's so hard to tell because these aren't new machines. You don't know if those parts have worn down differently. But no, thankfully I have not had breakages on either one.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that also can happen to other older ThinkPads that you might have repaired on your own. So if you, after 20 years, you think now is the right time to fix the display hinges because they are kind of worn out, that's okay, but you really need to double check that you do not add too much force to the screws when fixing those. That's one of my personal nightmares, that I crash one of my machines by tightening the screws too much.
Yes, I'm not. I don't have all the talent that Polymat does. So if I take apart something and break it, I'm in real trouble.
Oh yeah, I just saw that you happened to interview Polymat, who is known for the 701c.org website. Very interesting. I need to watch that interview.
No, he's a phenomenal guy. I love talking to him, and I'm very appreciative of everything that he does.
And I think he's also from Germany, right? I read that somewhere, that he might be living in Germany.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. I'm not sure.
So let's focus on the legacy. I think we pointed out that this machine is pretty outstanding. And one of the quotes from the Laptop magazine 2017 is, the first laptop that was developed exclusively after Lenovo bought the brand, 2008's ThinkPad X300 is one of the best laptops ever made by any brand. And I think that's a really, really good statement about the brand and the X300 itself.
Mm-hmm.
So what came after the X300? You just mentioned we have the X301. That's the second and the last model of the X300 series that was released in August 2008, manufactured until May of 2010. It had new CPUs, so still ultra low voltage CPUs, but at least we have now the Core 2 SU9000 series. We have 1.2 up to 1.6 gigahertz, up to 8 GB of DDR3 memory, and I think that's a real game changer when I have a look at my X301. It has a display port, which is lacking on the X300, right?
Yes. So what they did is they moved the USB port on the back and they added the display port. So you can see on the top, that's the 301 with the display port here, and then they shoved the USB port over here.
Yeah, very good, because otherwise this machine only has VGA, and VGA can be quite daunting if you want to go higher than 1080p. I think it's not possible to have a higher resolution than 1080p, or at least not if you want to have proper display quality.
No, and forward thinking to go with DisplayPort full size, not mini DisplayPort. Looking at you, Apple. And HDMI was not like fully spread as the standard at that point, especially on like projectors and other high-end displays that you'd see in workplaces.
I mean, it's still up these days, so a lot of notebooks have HDMI right now, but back then DisplayPort was more widespread. And did you know that DisplayPort does not require a license fee while HDMI does? That's the reason why a lot of special interest hardware such as single board computers tend to have sometimes only one HDMI port, and also try to have other ports like DisplayPort.
Yeah, and it's just I don't have the science to back it up, but I feel like it's a more reliable port. Yes. That's probably why on the back of your GPU you always have more DisplayPort than you do HDMI.
Definitely, yeah. So after the X301, we had the X1, not to be confused with the X1 Carbon, so that also came later. But the X1 was released in 2011. That offered new CPUs, new chipsets, but we had the 16:9 display ratio instead of 16:10. And I'm happy that we do not have those 16:9 displays anymore. Do you have some personal notes on the display form factor?
I use so many display form factors. Like I've used 3x2, 4x3, 16:10. I think is a good compromise. But I do like a good like 3x2 or 4x3 still, just because of the content that I'm working on. I do like that verticality. We all know why 16:9 won, and it had to do with DVD formats and stuff like that being a huge push. But yeah, I am not sad to see 16:9 go.
Yeah. Another thing the X1 had was Gorilla Glass, and unfortunately, depends on your personal opinion, but we do not have clamshell design anymore. So that's a break in terms of the ThinkPad design language, I would say. Also, we do not have ThinkLight anymore, and we have a built-in battery. So what do you think about the X1? Did you have your hands on one of those machines?
Yes, very early in the channel's lifespan, and I actually would love to get one again and review it again, because I just know so much more about ThinkPads and their history that I look back at my own video on it and I was like, oh my gosh, there is so much that I did not know and I have missed or I have learned since then. And I actually have a really big soft spot for the X1, because what they were trying to do is like, well, we want to keep up the same level of innovation that we did with the X300, but we don't want it to be as expensive. And the X1 was one of two avenues that things went in terms of trying to solve that problem. The S suffix series, which we'll talk about in a bit, is one of them. But yeah, the X1 in a lot of ways had a lot of the stuff that was left out of the X300. It had the port covers and all of the other details. So I look back at that and I want to get one in my shop again to look at, because the carbons that came after it don't look like it, and it doesn't look like an X300. It is a very, very unique machine, and unfortunately, because of how it is named, it is so hard to look up information because of how modern internet search engines work. You pretty much always have to search that machine with the date that it came out, or you get X1 carbon something else. Like, no, I just want the X1. Well, what do you mean? And it's like, no, there was this thing called the X1, Google. I'm telling you, you gotta believe me. Show me the pages.
Yeah, it's also hard to find those machines online. First of all, because it's an old machine by these days. And as you mentioned, even search engines on eBay and all those other sources where you get your used hardware do not understand that you want to get an X1 without a carbon in the name. So what I did is that I looked up the type that's written on the back, and I created a search interest on various websites where you can find old hardware. Because sometimes people find old ThinkPads in the basement of a family member that died or something like that, and they do not know about the machines, and they just turn it over and see, aha, Lenovo type, okay, I'm going to put this in the auction title. And by that, I managed to get an X1 without a carbon. But I think it took me several years to get one in a decent shape and at a fair price. So yeah, been there, done that.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed that you will get a good-looking X1 into your collection.
Yeah.
So after the X1, we reached the level of X1 Carbon series, and Lenovo called that one the grandfather. The X300 was the grandfather of the X1 Carbon series. So it's the 14-inch successor of the X1, and it was announced as an Ultrabook in 2012. So just 1 year after the X1 was released, and they are still produced these days. So as we heard, the 14th generation is the very latest addition to that family. And it looks very different from the X300, as you mentioned, but some of the ThinkPad DNA can still be seen. So the clear design language, the black-looking device, and so on. That's still part of the design, but it's a way more modern design approach, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have a lot of other machines, as you just mentioned. Which ones would that be?
So the family of machines that, if you want to talk about, like, I don't know, direct successor of the X300, it's like the T400S, the T410S, T420S, that sort of thing. And the reason that I say that, and I've got a T410 here, and I'm going to put them on top of one another. Let me do it the right way around, is if you look visually at the back of these machines, the port layout is almost the same.
Wow, yeah. You're totally right.
And then if you look at the optical bay situation on one side, with the exception of the thickness, it is the same. And the other piece is that if you look at the bottom of the machines, the battery and RAM placement, I'll back up, is identical.
Definitely.
So if you want to talk about what, like, they didn't just drop, I don't think, the X300 design. What they did is they said, okay, well, what if it doesn't have to be that thin? What can we do with it? And I truly believe that's what became the S line for the time that they ran it. And I think they ran it because they still wanted the X1 and the X1 Carbon to be the super duper thin and light, cutting edge machine. But I think they also understood that there is this in-between customer that doesn't want to spend that kind of money for the bleeding edge tech, and bleeding edge tech, especially then, I don't know if it's necessarily the case now. Like, people did not want to be early adopters because they got the sense that I am part of your testing cycle, and I do not like this. I want to buy a product that is reliable, that has been tested, that's got components in it that are well understood by manufacturers and assemblers, that sort of thing. And it did create this intermediary market where it's like, well, I don't want a full-sized T series, but I also don't have enough money to buy an X1 Carbon. So, like, it's like, oh, well, I don't have enough money to buy a Rolls-Royce Phantom, but I do have enough money to buy a Rolls-Royce Ghost.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah. I also have a T400 and 400S and T410S in my collection, and those are really lovely machines, and they're completely different from each other. Because if you don't know and you hear, okay, there's a T400 and a T400S, you would just think, okay, it's a slightly similar variant, but no, it's a completely different design. The mainboard layout looks completely different. The spare parts aren't compatible with each other. So it's a completely different design, and therefore we can see a lot of the X300 series DNA in it. I never had the idea of comparing those two machines. That's kind of mind-blowing that they are so comparable to each other.
Yeah, it's the benefit of what I do is I've got to look at like hundreds of laptops, and so you start to be like, oh, this kind of looks like this, and this kind of looks like that. And when you're dealing with manufacturers that are the same, and it's like, this isn't an accident. Like, there's probably some a story here, and sometimes I can talk to the people that were there to tell me, yes, what you see is true, or let me tell you about the trouble we got in, or something like that. And sometimes you don't get the opportunity to confirm that, but at the same time, the evidence can be very, very strong, and I think it is for the T400S, that if you really wanted a successor to the X300, that's what it is. The X1 and X1 Carbon was continuing the journey of making the craziest and coolest and thinnest and lightest machine that we possibly can. That's going to resonate with what people expect the best ultra portable to be. And I think that's the best way to look at the X1 series, is that it's the best that an ultra portable can be at that time. And that's a really difficult thing for some to look back at and be like, they were so much better back then. And it's like, well, it's not that simple, but okay, enjoy your nostalgia.
Yeah, definitely. I was just thinking about what the differences between the T14 and the T14S series might be these days. I have a T14 G3 and a P14S G3 that are nearly the same. I would say the most of the parts are changeable between those two machines. But I think the difference between T14 and T14S isn't that huge anymore, like it was for the T400 and T400S, right?
Yeah, so what I can tell you about that, because those were machines I was looking at when I bought the X1 Nano, is the T14S is an X13 motherboard.
Ah, okay.
Like, it's like the parts are, I don't think they're quite interchangeable, but it's practically the same. Like, that's what they did. And okay. I was like, okay, so what I'm really doing is I'm making a decision there between, do I want my X13 to have a 14-inch display? And I think the only way that they were able to allow that category to persist in terms of it not costing more is because it's the same system board in both machines. And I believe at the time, I don't know if they've differentiated it now, the maintenance manual was the same. So you'll know how they combine maintenance manual products with similar products, where, like, the certain P series had the same maintenance manual as the T series because it was the same, just the system board was different. So they would combine it and it would say like T blah 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 comma P series service manual, and it was the same for the T and the X, or the TS series and the X series at one point.
That's a good catch. That's a good source of having a look at it, because in the hardware maintenance manual we see all those details, and also would totally make sense because I can remember that the T14S variants at some time had USB4, while the normal T14s still had no USB4 for the AMD variants. So it totally would make sense because the X13 had a different update cycle. Very interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of weird what you read in there, and it's like all of a sudden this stuff makes sense. Like, it was a maintenance manual where I discovered that the LG IBM thing in Korea was something. And that was
that's a very interesting rabbit hole. Definitely, I saw this on your website. I didn't know that before I had it in my eyes on your website.
There's a whole other story there for another time.
Definitely. Do we have any closing thoughts about the X300?
I mean, I think at the beginning we started off by saying it was probably one of the most important ThinkPads that they ever made, but I think at the end of the conversation, I've certainly convinced myself, I don't know about you, that it was. I think I can double down on that with a lot more confidence after talking to you about it, that if we look at all of the things that did, not only just for the company, but all these product lines that we still have with us today, and all of the things that were either planned for the X300 or that were on the X300 that are still here, I think it's really hard to point at a machine older that is still as significant in terms of longevity. Like, yes, the 700C was the first black ThinkPad with the track point. You're never going to take that away from the 700C. But beyond that one feature and the color, not anything else really persists. And that's not to say that those are not very iconic and very important things. You always know where the ThinkPad in the room is. But when you talk about like the design language and some of the features and how these things are built, like that, I think the farthest you can go back definitively is the X300 today.
Definitely. I learned very much about the X300. I hadn't had a look that deep at the machine by now. Maybe because I have way too much ThinkPads in my collection and it's impossible to have that in-depth view at all the machines like you had for the X300. So thanks a lot. I really learned a lot about those machines and about all the things that weren't part of the X300 but that were parts of later notebooks, as we just mentioned. So I totally agree on that this is a very significant machine and it had to be a success. Otherwise, I think the ThinkPad history for Lenovo would have gone in a completely different direction. And I'm so glad that it went that road and that we have a very awesome X300 and a lot of awesome slim notebooks that came after that machine. So Thomas, thanks a lot for sharing all the nifty details about the machine. It was very interesting and I was really glad that we finally managed to set up a conversation and talking to you in person and not just watching your videos.
No, absolutely, Christian. This was a long time coming. I'm really glad that we did it, and I hope we can have the opportunity to do it again in the future.
Definitely. I would highly do this once again. Definitely. Had a lot of fun with it. So, dear listener, if we didn't lose you in one of the last 2 hours and you made it that far in the podcast episode, thanks a lot for listening. That's awesome that you listened to all the details that we just had a look at. Check out the show notes. Definitely make your way there because we have a lot of interesting links to share. Of course, we have Thomas' website and his YouTube channel. We have all the interviews about the X300. We have all the hardware information and the advertisements and so on and the successors. So if you really want to go deep that role and want to see all the devices that came afterwards, just have a look there. You will find anything you didn't know that you would need it. If you have constructive criticism or feedback, feel free to drop me a mail at podcast@thinkpad-museum.de. I also like to see ratings via the podcatcher of your choice. And if you're in the Fediverse, then feel free to follow me on Mastodon. You can find this on ThinkPad Museum at podcasts.social. So thanks again, Thomas. It was a pleasure. And I hope that we can continue this at some time. And dear listener, thanks a lot for listening. See you next time.